Hey everybody, before we get started, I wanted to just make mention of a few things that we will probably end up referencing throughout the episode in terms of different coaches and schools that we feature here at Platform. If you want to check any of those out, I always link them out to our blog posts and different things like that. But the easiest place to go find everything is at platform.com. That's PLT4M.com, where we have great features of different coaches, teachers, schools, and also a lot of coaches and teachers not at this Platform office writing and talking about their own personal experiences, which has been a really cool kind of initiative that we're taking on here at Platform to give more folks like yourself a voice. So go check that out at PLT4M.com. Let's go ahead and get started. This is Chalk Talk presented by Platform. Let's go. All right, we are jumping in to a topic that might not seem, sexy right off the bat, but it's something I think that's important in warm-up. And I'm actually going to use the word jumping in to kind of set the discussion up, because I think obviously we work with a lot of coaches and teachers that have tight time windows, working with high school kids, and often are maybe them or their student athletes want to just jump right into workouts and probably skip over the warm-up.
Sure.
I feel good, I'm young, I'm fresh, I'm just going to jump in, throw some weights on the bar and get going. So before we even get into the do's, don'ts, and what have yous of warm-up, why don't we set the stage as to why it's important just in general?
Sure. Yeah, you're right. I think warming up is one of those things that, at least until recently, wasn't necessarily considered the sexiest or the most important part of training. I certainly remember back when I was an athlete, that the warm-up itself was the worst part if I was forced to do it, and if I wasn't being forced to do it, I wasn't going to do it at all.
Right.
But I think, the reason for basically placing warming up on a pedestal that is, equally as important as, say, your strength work or your power work or your whatever work of the day, thinking of it as just another section of your workout, why should you do that is, I think, first, I did as much, deep dive into the research as possible. There are so many, and I mean so many different studies, not that studies are necessarily the gold standard of what you should always be, addressing in your training by their results, but there are so many studies that say that, one, it absolutely does not in any way have a negative side effect. Okay, so warming up does not increase injury risk or decrease performance or anything along those lines. What it does say is, by and large, a good warm-up, which we'll talk about like what that is, will increase performance, whether it be on the field, in the gym. Your rate of force development will increase, your maximal sprint speeds, your range of motion, and all of those things go up, which we know, like if you and I, you know it more the older you get, right? Like you realize that getting out of bed in the morning just takes a little bit of warming up to feel your best. Same thing goes for in a specific, target environment like a workout or a competition. And this one's been debated a bunch of times, but I'm not really sure why. There are a lot of studies there was the belief that warming up would reduce injury risk. And then there were some studies that came out that were like, there's no evidence of that. And so people were like, so why are we think it's going to prevent injury? Why? Then there's a whole bunch of, there are, again, multitudes of studies that say yes, no, significant percentage decrease in on-field or in-gym activity injury rates will decline if you have had a proper warm-up prior to it.
Right.
And then I think if you can believe it or not, my actual second point, that was all 1 point.
Okay, that's point one.
Why should you do it? It's going to hopefully reduce injury. It's certainly not going to increase it, and it will increase performance. We know that. The second thing is, again, if you're not thinking of it as just the precursor to what you really care about, aka lifting, and you think about it as just another element of training, your warm-up will include things like technique work, range of motion, core, all of these things that are important, even just static stretching, which we'll talk about because that's a big heated debate. If that's something that you are dealing with daily because it's in your training via a warm-up, you see results because of consistency over time, right? So it's a part of your training. It's not the pre-training,
Yeah.
if that makes sense.
No, I think that's an important point. I try to hammer home with my kids a lot. Is like, I'm not looking for you to like magically, like, just be in the most like basic sense warmed up because like you were doing nothing. Now you're doing something and you've like warmed up your body. Like, I'm looking for you in the first like, and I, you know, a lot like 10 minutes, 15 minutes to start to focus in on a lot of those different things. Cause to the same like counterpoint of people being like, well, we only have so much time. Kids are running around. Like, if a kid's coming in, like, and all of a sudden you expect them to nail it right from the beginning, like the warm-up's a good place where they can kind of set their mind right, get fixed, and also start to focus on form, technique, and other things, as opposed to just thinking like, hey, let's go and you have to nail it right from the starting point.
100%. I mean, you wouldn't teach another class without kind of gradually building up to, okay, now we're going to dive into these, you know, differential equations in calculus, right? Like, you're going to build up like, hey, what did we review last week? Well, we'll talk about this, we'll do that. You know, progression in anything makes the most sense. I think everybody agrees with that, but for some reason the warm-up's not necessarily always considered a part of that equation. I think, you know, also worth noting is that the warm-up is something that doesn't need to take forever. So I think there's the two extremes. There's the people that say, I don't have time, warm-ups are worthless. I've seen one very, very prominent, you know, especially high school Twitter coach said, like, look, I've been around for 20 years, and at this point, I was big warm-up guy. Now I'm saying, I don't think they're worth anything. Then there's the other people that say, like, I need to warm up for 20 minutes, 30 minutes, 50 minutes before I start working out. And it's like, it doesn't have to be that way. Make a section of your training at the beginning something that serves to warm you up while also getting things done. Because, you know, Squat University said it. It's like, if the highest level athletes in the world, even if we're just talking weightlifting, Olympic weightlifters, will warm up before they get going.
Well, that's actually who got me thinking about this topic in general, because Squat University, who's Aaron Horschik, who's been on this podcast, has some great tweets and different things that he will send out, especially for like athletes and folks that are thinking about. And it's like, no, like, you doing like one set of an empty barbell before adding on a bunch of weight isn't even a warm-up. Like, take like one or two steps before that, if anything. And he does a really good job of setting it up in terms of what you just described. It's not this long, extensive thing. No. Aaron would probably say, and I don't want to put words in his mouth, trend a little bit longer, but it also, like, you can't just do, you know, 10 air squats and be like, I'm good to go.
Yeah. It's got to be a part of your training. And it's not, what do you do so that you get to work out? It's the part of the workout at the beginning that sets you up for success throughout the rest of it. And somebody that's only a weightlifter might do 40 minutes of prep because their training might only be like 20 or 30 minutes of really highly condensed specific work.
Sure.
And they need to prep for that. We're not talking about that. We're just saying, can we get ready, for what's going to happen over the next, call it 45 minutes? And I think the easiest way to sell it, look, if you are somebody that trains on a daily basis or ever or at all, you know, I'd be hard pressed to find somebody that says, I feel better when I don't warm up at all than when I do.
Right.
Whether or not I want to is a whole different question. But whether or not I feel better having warmed up, I don't know a single person that's not like, 5 to 10 minutes of getting moving in some capacity, I feel better and more ready to work out.
Yeah, and I think the hardest thing is given the nature of a high school student, like I made mention to at the very beginning, I have tons of kids that will come to me being like, what are we doing this for? Like, I
feel fresh.
I feel fresh. Like, well, so that's goes back to the same idea of like these high school kids have just so much pumping through their body. They're
freshmen say that.
Yeah.
When you start, like when I get into like my seniors, like in football season, they're like, can we make this a little longer? Like you would be surprised. Like, yeah, that ninth grader is just like, spring chicken. Senior has already an 18-year-old, which doesn't sound super old, but we've put them through the ringer.
No, you're right. I had one of our first championship competitions that kind of go into our postseason, and one of my top athletes, who's a senior, came in the next day. Was like, and he had the meat of his life. Like, oh, I'm still like,
I need some work to get back to neutral.
Right, let's go back. Yeah,
and then I'm ready to get after it again. And I think that's an important point. Is if you want to maximize the workout. Again, I would push you to think of the whole thing as the workout.
Yeah.
But to the meat and potatoes of it, it's worth spending the time on. Is that an absolute black or white? Can somebody convince me of, hey, for this person or for me or for this group, it's not worth my time? I'm sure you can find that situation. But by and large, warming up is something that I think is, personally, I think is one of the largest, and we're talking about the total of all the things we're going to mention of what's useful.
Sure.
Is one of the single greatest things I can do for my athletes, advanced or novice.
Perfect. I think that's a great kind of little segment in terms of the importance of it. Like we try to do a lot of times, and putting all of these little different puzzle pieces that we have all together. And that's what makes this podcast so fun. And now you always know where I like to go to. Now, Coach Bres, tell me what it actually is. Because, we can talk warm up all you want, but what does it look like or consist of in, your programming or what you're trying to get kids to get through in a given warm up?
Yeah, sure. I think that's the way we'll do it, is we'll kind of talk about it the way we think of it, what progression we follow. By no means are we unique. I think this is what most people do, and for good reason. But I think the goal first, before you do anything else in the gym, we think of it as elevating heart rate. So light aerobic movement of any kind.
And I think that part's important, because anytime some people hear light aerobic movement, they just think running, or jogging, and
I prefer, honestly, I think if I could go back and direct it, I would buy a ton of stationary bikes. I think they're, especially the ones of any kind, assault or otherwise, that have upper and lower, just a full body, no impact, light conversational pace where you could sit there 2 or 3 minutes, talk to somebody next to you without ever being out of breath, but you are moving. The goal is to basically increase your circulatory system's rate of delivery of blood. So just heart rate up.
Right.
Blood goes to your entire body at higher levels and frequency.
But even sans machines of like bikes or anything else like that, you could do jumping jacks.
Jumping jacks, absolutely. Look, I was going to mention this later, but this could also be like the beginning of class, like, hey, we're going to go spend 5 minutes playing a quick game of knockout.
Yeah.
If you want to do something more interesting than sitting on a bike, because it's like very targeted training-esque stuff, we'll play tag, you play whatever, like that's totally cool.
Yeah.
Obviously you want to keep it relatively low intensity just because you're still trying to warm up, but I think that's totally fine. Because when you elevate body temperature, what you're actually going to do is make muscle glycogen more available, which is good for obviously working out. You're going to increase rate of force development, potential rate of force development, aka power, because of increased speed of nerve transmission, and you're going to increase tissue elasticity, which for in the most literal senses, you feel like you can move through greater ranges of motion without pain or difficulty, because tissue has become a little bit more pliable and stretchy, not to TB12 it up. But you just want to get things going. Think about starting the engine. We're just going to send gasoline or oil more aptly to the body so that it feels like it can move and it has a bit more of like it's been turned on.
Sure. So it's been turned on. That light cardio is part one. After that, what do you get to next?
So this is one of those where it's like, start with a light aerobic and then go to this, or this can also replace the light aerobic. Okay. But I think of it as and this is probably more frequently used, especially in big groups, is the dynamic warm up, in its most literal sense of, you do line drills, 10 yards of walking, high knee to RDL, alternating steps, you go 10 yards and you just continuously move for 5 minutes through, call it gym or sport specific movements, so that you are warming up kind of specific joint areas.
Yep.
It serves a lot of the same purpose, plus that like joint specific or muscle specific range of motion. So I like doing both.
Yeah.
But you could get away with not doing the light aerobic. I love personally starting with 2 or 3 minutes just to like even mentally set myself up and then move into, targeted, either it's walking dynamic stretching, which is what it's called, or something stationary like an alternating Spider-Man and reach, also known as literally on the internet world's greatest stretch, right? Because it's continuous, it's movement, it's combination stretch plus dynamic, that's going to give you the benefit of kind of both worlds. And I think that in my mind, I always go like 2 minutes of light aerobic just to turn the engine on, and then 3 minutes of some version of that dynamic mobility, dynamic warm-up movement, it's a progression. It's easy monostructural. Now it's a little bit more complex, all the while kind of, bringing the heart rate and body temperature up.
Yeah. And I think some sports are more accustomed or familiar to line drills, football being one of them in terms of you're doing it. But I think there's a lot of benefit to line drills for everybody.
I love them.
Because it also just sets people up as like, we're part of a team. It's cool. Everybody kind of always circles back and is chatting and getting into it. And it's just like a cool,
continuous.
It's one of those things that I never really thought of or did. And then I started to put it into one of my teams this fall. And it was just this cool way where everybody's starting to get into it.
If you're starting at the same time, I'd argue that's the best way to do it. Now, and this is a great little kind of side note, is to the point that we mentioned earlier about don't just use the warm-up as the warm-up, use it for other things. If you're going to do line drills, this should be an opportunity to talk movement mechanics.
Yep.
Every single day of practice, even just as a football coach, when we go through our dynamic warm-up on the field, there is not a day that I don't talk about specifically the RDL and hinging, right? Because it's a great opportunity to reinforce proper movement mechanics. It's also a possible opportunity for them to really, really reinforce bad habits if they're doing it lazily.
Yeah.
If they think of it as, I'm just moving to warm up, all of a sudden the pelvis is twisting, we're rotating on our hinging, and we're now, the moment we get into weighted stuff, that's the movement pattern we know, because we've done that so much.
Sure.
So I think it's a really good kind of reinforcement of hey, use it for more than just getting moving, and don't neglect, technique when it's something as simple as a warm-up, because that's where you're going to really learn it.
Yep, for sure. And I think that's a good breakdown. So we have now light cardio or elevate heart rate, and then some dynamic movement, and you can kind of mix or match the two of those things. So however you put together that combo, you've done that. Now what comes next?
So this is, for us, again, I say for us, this is where at times we will implement versions of, call it, more static mobility, aka static stretching, or mobilization of joints via, releasing certain areas, activating others with foam rollers, lax balls, etc. This is probably the most quote unquote controversial part of the warm up. There are people that will go to the grave fighting you, saying it's the single greatest thing that you can ever do. There are people saying that you are the dumbest person in the world for doing static stretching before lifting. I think it's worth maybe diving into discussion of static stretching, because that's probably the most prevalent within training program warm-ups now, and people fighting it.
Yeah, but I agree, and we can definitely dive into that. Do you feel as if, though, the banner is static stretching for that next part, or is it more so something else? As in mobility or things like that? Because I think sometimes, we've talked about it even in here of the difference between mobility, stretching, those different types of things. Is that where it starts to get muddled, or people start to debate different things? Or
sure. For us, we absolutely we look at the goal of this particular section. Actually, we've just started moving.
Yeah.
My next goal is, let's make sure that we are optimally primed for the movements we are going to perform in the gym. AKA, can we get through a complete range of motion with complete stability, so that our movement is as good as possible, which will influence how much weight we can move, how much force we can generate. Yeah. So I'm not saying I'm stretching to get flexible. I'm saying if we're going to be in a deep back squat today and I want to move as much weight as possible, something like Dr. Horschig would mention is like, I should probably sit in my squat stance for a minute or two, which we do. We do pull squats. You hold the squat. It's going to activate the core while also working through static stretches of your ankles, your hips, everything else. We might do joint distraction, which is the actual act of separating let's say maybe the humeral head from your shoulder joint, allowing joint fluid to synovial fluid to go in and create that lubrication that allows for greater range of motion. We do that with the band mobility, right? That's what we're actually doing when we say grab a band, tie it up to the top of a rig, hold so that we're actually going to separate that joint, allow fluid to jump in there essentially and become easier to manipulate through all of its ranges of motion.
Sure.
But we also do simple static stretches.
Yeah, so then
right?
that's perfect, because that's that answers that part of the question, because I get that a lot even when I'm talking with kids. It's like, well, are we stretching? Are we doing like? So let's now just dive right into the static stretching. And like you mentioned or alluded to, like there's a lot of people that will die on one hill or the other. So maybe, I don't know which way you want to start, but I'd love to hear what you've run into in terms of people being against it.
Yeah,
and then
I think try to just do like a background of the like trajectory of where it's come from and gone to. Static stretching was for a long time the only thing people did to warm up, right? And recently, I mean, I was a senior in high school in 2005, if you can call that prep school, or 2004 in high school, and our entire practice warm-up was static. And it was like 20 minutes long, right? We loved it because we'd be laying down, and that's what people do. I still go to games on Friday nights where people are doing static stretches before a game. It is what most of us, prior to 2000, grew up with as the proper way to prepare your body for activity. Everybody said stretching is good for you, it reduces injuries, makes you more flexible, flexibility is good. Then everybody started saying, okay, well, is this actually good for performance? Like, why do we think it's good? And they started doing studies, and then they came out with studies that said if you're going to do static stretching, you're actually going to reap a slight decrease in maximal strength, maximal power, sprint speed. And everybody goes, whoa, everybody's freaking out. Like, static stretching is the devil before workouts. And so then it was relegated to, okay, you should do that after.
Right.
Or some other time in the day. It's still good for you, but don't do it before you work out or compete. Then, all right, and I've done, again, in the last 10 years, a lot of research surrounding the role of static stretching, because everybody, like, there's all these diehards that say, like, no, this is what we do. And then there are the people that say, like, I think it's going to make you a worse athlete on the field or in the gym. So people said, okay, let's figure out what the role of static stretching is. By and large, the results are this. Static stretching, if done for less than a minute, right? Like if you're not holding for 3, 4, 5 minutes, like big, long yoga holds, if you're doing a pigeon pose for 30 seconds on each leg, you're going to increase range of motion and flexibility, and you will not decrease strength or power. It has also been shown that even if you do those minute-long ones, 90-second-long ones, if you then follow it up, as we'll talk about after, with what they call sport-specific movement, because it's less about in the gym and more about on the field with a lot of these studies, basically, are you then going to warm up again? Like, are you going to then make sure things are switched on and activated? And are you going to prep your movement of the day? Are you going to lift light first and then lift heavy? You will not see any decrease.
Yeah.
So again, and then there was like one perfect example is, and again, do never take one study and say like, this is why, but a great example that just, I'm just using as a summary of the argument. They took a bunch of D1 female soccer players and did a study of squat strength with static stretching before as a protocol for warm-up and without. And the ones that did stretch saw 0 decrease in strength. Some actually saw a slight increase, likely because of range of motion, and they saw a large increase in range of motion, aka static flexibility. They were using the sit and reach. I know a lot of people would argue that there is actually a point where true just like flexibility, how far can a muscle stretch, is actually not great for performance because you do want the ability for it to be strong, tight, etc.
Yeah,
at times.
tension.
But anyway, we're not going to get into that because I think that's a really small kind of, end of the spectrum type of note or caveat. But for most people, I'd argue that in a workout, if you do it with the right reason, aka you are priming specific joints because of specific movement patterns that you'd like to maximize in a workout, then static flexibility is something that can be quite useful. As long as you do it within reason, you're not doing it for 3 minutes. You're not holding a pigeon pose for 3 minutes. You're holding for 30 seconds so you can grease the groove for your squat. So you want to get below parallel.
Right.
And then I think maybe more importantly is if it doesn't really affect your performance in the gym, I'd argue that we only see our athletes once a day, and we can only guarantee that they're going to do what we want them to do while they're there with us. I would like to take 3 minutes each day and put them in some sort of flexibility, range of motion, mobility work, so that I know if they don't do anything outside of the gym, they are going to get that every day for 4 years, so that over time, you should be able to sit in the bottom of a squat, as Dr. Horschig told you to do, and you've been doing a lot of. And what has it done for that bad ankle of yours?
Right, and I've been able to keep my foot on the ground and everything else like that. So, I mean, I love it. Because again, I am just very used to being able to personally just go in and, for lack of a better word, grip it and rip it and work out. And every day goes by.
Just wait, buddy.
I try. You tell me, and it's just like, okay, start to do a little bit more warm up. So no, that's a good flesh out here. So if you'll allow me to keep stacking the different elements,
please.
Just kind of to keep it in line, we've done the elevated heart rate, cardio. We start to do some dynamic movement, even maybe some stretching, depending on if you've been sold by Coach Bres's monologue there. And then now I think we are trending towards almost being ready, but there's, in your eyes, probably one more little step or larger step.
Yeah, sure.
Before we kind of finish warm-up.
Yep. And I would call this next section, we're going to call it activation, blanket term for those that are more familiar with the verbiage in the strength and conditioning field. I'm not talking about just the very, very specific act of neuromuscular activation for turning muscles on specifically. I'm talking kind of a little bit more vaguely, and this is another one of those kind of can be a little bit of all over the place in our list. So, for example, we talked about mobility being not just static stretching; it's also stability through a range of motion.
Yep.
This is
you've already kind of alluded to this in the first couple of parts, and it can flow in and out. It's not do one before two before three, of all right, you're activating, you're getting ready for different movements, and now you're starting to think about
Yep. So I think more specifically, or I guess it's more simply, we elevated the body temperature. We've kind of increased our range of motion more passively in a little cold environment. Now we want to kind of heat things up again with some light resistance that forces our muscles to turn on, right, to get ready. So what I'm looking at is things that are as simple as prehab / prep for pressing, aka pressing and pulling. Maybe we're doing a band pull-aparts, right? You see those all over Twitter. It's one of everybody's favorites, right? Band pull-aparts is great for rotator cuff health and scap development, subscap, and all this other stuff.
I think about this step that you're describing a lot of times in terms of seeing the different bands, or the quick, you just talked about, the movement prep of some lightweight,
light dumbbells, shoulder rotation. Shoulder's probably the easiest because it's the most obvious in terms of it being what people think of as prehab, although again, injury prevention is your whole workout. It's not just small things, but those are important. And also, very much so, we are talking about that true, what is activation of a muscular group, because, for example, we do a lot of core, and when I say core, I'm talking both anterior through your abs, your posterior from, basically your erectors down, and then also glutes, hips, front and back, for things like if we're going to deadlift or squat heavy, I want your glutes turned on. There's this big thing called gluteal amnesia that a lot of people have because when you sit down, your hip flexors, which is called all the muscles on the front of your hip, more or less, are forced to be shortened, aka on, which turns off everything on the back.
Yep.
And then if you do this enough times throughout the day, throughout your weeks and years, your brain will actually lose the connection to your glutes, which is a big piece of a real, proper, healthy, powerful squat or deadlift. And so we want to make sure, like, are those on before you go do it? Because you can compensate. Like, I've had this problem, right? Like,
Yeah, you go to the muscles that maybe haven't been turned off.
So
you're just now using something else.
Eyeball test of my deadlift might look perfect, but I might not be using any of the muscles that I'm supposed to be. So what we're trying to do is make sure that all of those things are on. And it also means that you are now going to be your most powerful. If everything that is supposed to be on is on, and you can maximize the recruitment of those muscles, then you're going to be able to lift more weight. So big heavy back squat or deadlift day, it might be glute bridges, hammy bucks, where we are literally kind of
Whoops, the camera timed out on us, and so we had to stop, get reset up, and pick up our conversation where we left off, and fire that tech guy.
Stupid camera.
All right, there's a little hiccup on the tech side. The tech guy has been fired again, and that is me. We were mid-conversation around kind of getting everything activated, and Coach Bres was using the examples of the kind of deadlift or the back squat, and obviously it cut out, and I want to jump back in there. And kind of my follow-up question to you with all of those different types of things is like, all right, you've talked about like the movement, the heart rate's up, everything's kind of activated, you're ready to jump into your main sets of the day. Like, is that it? Or is there now the second layer of what you've been describing?
Right. So in my mind, this whole last piece is both activation and or movement prep in general, which might include some targeted activation like those glute bridges or core or whatever it is that you're doing maybe before a heavy deadlift or whatever. But then, I actually want to grab an empty barbell and work the movement pattern that I am going to be training heavy. Technique, because if you're not working your technique consciously every single day, you're missing out. The elite weightlifters will work their technique every single day because they're not perfect, you're not perfect. It's a great opportunity to make sure that you're moving well, which obviously will help reduce injury, but also maybe more importantly for you move well, you'll move more weight, right? So after maybe our more isolated or targeted activation, I'm a big fan of grabbing an empty barbell, doing your complexes. Maybe if it's deadlift back squat day, it's posterior chain warm up where 5 good mornings, 5 back squats, maybe 5 press from a back rack, 5 RDLs. Because then you're going to work all of your ranges of motion, positions and everything else. You're also going to maybe jack that heart rate back up a little bit, so that you are again in your most elastic, your most turned on, ready to go. And then don't just jump into a heavy set. Maybe work your way up with we program with percentages your warm-up sets, right. Because we also want to make sure that we control how much volume you do in a day, because a kid might do 1 set at 135 and jump to 250. We might not think that's the best idea. Another kid might do like a set at 150, a set at 170, a set at 190, a set at 210, because he's nervous about making that jump. I don't want him to do all of that volume, so I want to control it. So, once you've activated, once we've prepped our movements, once we've worked our movements, we load our movements and we build up in our loading.
Yeah, and I think that's worth noting is that like what you're really kind of getting at too is like there's warm up to be warmed up with your body, and it goes back to what you've just described and what we're really hammering home is like there's also warm up for high school student athletes in a weight room to feel the movement and get comfortable within that movement in terms of like, yeah, I'm sure there's people out there that could just, and there's plenty that do, just throw the weight on the bar and do their heavy set right from the get-go because they just do that. But like we're talking about, again, high school kids that like would benefit from the actual like feeling and movement of a barbell on their back, barbell with some weight before you get to that.
And don't underestimate the power of psychology, where a kid's going to be far more intimidated at 250, less willing to give it his shot, even if he knows he's a strong kid, if he literally looks at that bar and sees 250 first.
Right.
Whereas empty bar, easy. 135, man, I feel good today. 185, yeah, this is legit. 225, all right, it's challenging, but 250 is only another 20 pounds. I'm fine.
Sure.
So I think that's important to note. And then it doesn't have to end with your barbell movements. Later in workouts, when we have any sort of accessory work, capacity, finishers, anything else, we will say, we don't want you to necessarily, if we didn't target X, Y, and Z in our initial warm-up, hey, let's warm up our pulling.
Yeah.
I don't want you to jump right into strict pull-ups
And I
if we
think-
haven't done that today. Maybe we do a literal 1 minute distraction, activation through SCAP, 2 pull-ups, 3 strict pull-ups. Okay, now we're ready for whatever the actual workout is.
And I think that's a good point in terms of the finishers. You do a really good job in the programming in terms of having all right, we're not just jumping into the finisher. Let's do those movements a couple times through so you can feel it, activate the things that maybe haven't.
And again, a chance to get more work volume, right? You're actually practicing, you're doing things, and you're getting better at the technique, you're understanding your body better, you understand what loads work for you, etc.
Right, for sure. So, and I think a place to wrap up in the essence of time and making sure that, the tech guy doesn't get fired a 4th time over is let's kind of hammer home what I started this podcast and episode out with in terms of time. Because I think we need to hammer that in a little bit more, because there's going to be PE teachers and coaches saying, well, I only have 30 minutes. Or there's going to be a coach saying, well, I have an hour. So there's obviously no golden rule for warm-up, but what's the best way to try to frame it for those different groups so that they know, I'm getting what I need to get done, but not at the kind of failure of now running out of time to actually, we warmed up and now we have 5 minutes.
Yeah, there's no golden answer, and you shouldn't feel like you are beholden to a hard and fast rule of a certain number of minutes. Keep it proportional. I personally like to think of 15 minutes of warm up, and I'm talking everything, right? From the moment we start our light aerobic all the way through activation, barbell work into our warm-up sets, which I think is very important to note, does not feel like warm-up to an athlete if you programming it in any way, shape, or form creatively. My activation will double as a kind of core development superset. I might do that thing. That to an athlete will feel a little bit like the workout itself. We might put our power work via plyometrics in the warm-up. So 15 minutes, I'm not saying it's a 15-minute warm-up. It's the beginning 15 minutes of our workout of the day that might last 60 minutes.
Well, I think you've done a good job of laying out, too, to that exact point. When some people hear warm-up, they hear, go for the light cardio. And all they think of in warm-up is the light cardio.
And then it's lifting.
15 minutes of jogging, what's the point of that? But I think what you're getting at in terms of more of a well-rounded warm-up is that you're doing different types of things to the point. Also, you want kids to buy into it, get excited about it, and like you've talked about, all right, now we're doing things that feel like the workout itself, but really what we're doing is kind of manipulating the different things that we want to make sure get checked before they're doing movements.
And it's progressional, right? You can build up to your heaviest, your most intense items while still doing very important work early that is part of your warm-up. You're using it for mobility purposes, using it for activation and prehab and all of these things. And that way you don't necessarily have to say, I'm spending 15 minutes on warm-up. Spending 15 minutes on X, Y, and Z that is a good, proper way to warm up for other things. But like I said, keep it proportional. I have an hour with an athlete, 15 minutes. I think that's pretty good. A lot of the literature would say 15 minutes is a pretty good time domain. Again, literature, what does that really mean? I think anecdotally, or more importantly, my practical experience says 15 minutes is a good amount of time that kids will actually do without getting bored.
Yep.
And isn't just, kind of breezing through it and getting right into heavy lifting. The flip side of that is if you only have 30 minutes because athletes change before and after class and it's PE, maybe your warm-up's only 5 minutes, right? It's proportional. And then I would also argue, though, you don't have to think of something as only warm-up or only workout or only whatever, because if you're teaching the back squat and the X and the Y and the Z, your warm-up might really be the workout.
Right.
And that's that's okay. That's where you're getting initial core development. You're teaching foundational movement.
Sure.
You're starting to build some basic capacity, like volume, like warming up with, even if it's 5 sets of 5 air squats as your warm up before you teach the back squat. If somebody's just learned the air squat, 25 reps is not, again, they're not going to be sore, but it might be volume that you're putting onto their plate that's building them up over time.
Sure.
So your warm up could be, somebody could define your 30 minutes as like 20 minutes is a warm up and 10 minutes is workout. Somebody else could look at that exact same progression of items and say your warm up's only 5 minutes and the rest is your workout. But you've done the exact same thing. So it's all about your perspective and your goals for the day. What are you trying to accomplish, and how are you going to go about it in the most systematic and efficient way possible? You don't have to call something a warm-up. You can call 5 minutes a warm-up. You can call 10 minutes. You can call 15 minutes. It doesn't really matter.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point, and something, we've had different coaches and teachers write about and talk about, like, Coach Clausen at Conestoga in Nebraska, he just wrote an article that's on Platform's website. I'll put a link to it. It was like, I call it an instant activity. And it doesn't have to be anything. It's in my intro to strength and conditioning class. It's like we're playing tag, red light, green light, different types of things where it's like, all right, we're getting moving, we're getting comfortable, we're like kind of getting out of the rhythm of like a regular school day, right? Mm-hmm. Like not sitting at your desk, to your point about sitting all the time. And then a lot of it, because it's an intro to strength class, is a lot of that development and just the basics and foundational stuff.
Well, and it's got to be fun. And I think, and I mentioned it earlier, but I think I'm glad you brought that up, because it's super important to note that we're talking, especially in situations like that, where it's an intro to training class for freshmen in high school or eighth graders in middle school or whatever, and you might be only using empty barbells and you're just teaching. The warm-up doesn't have to be what maybe, an elite athlete goes into the physical weight room, uses a stationary bike, then does this band stretch, and then does this activation work. Go play a pickup game of knockout, like we mentioned earlier, play tag, make it fun. Yeah. I love that idea of instant activity. If I were, teaching intro to weight training, like, we prescribe warm-ups platform. If it was me, I might say, hey, I got the warm-up covered because I'm going to go do 10 minutes of this in the gym because it's more fun. The kids are going to get moving, and maybe they're going to be a bit more amenable to moving into the gym now and using the barbell. And
that's a great point. And the other one that we, just featured Coach Hewig out of North High School in Indiana, where he was basically like, my kids are in different programs because they're at different points in their training. We all go do the same warm-up, so everybody gets to know each other, gets to be a part of it, and feels like they're part of something, and we're not all doing different stuff.
Right.
So there's tons of different ways you can tweak it, tons of different ways you can kind of...
I think the important point is that a warm-up is useful and effective, and it can be efficient if you just put a little thought into each day. What are the purposes that I am trying to work towards with the things that I'm considering a warm-up, and what is that going to gain me long term?
Yep, for sure. And I think that's a great place to wrap. So thanks for bearing with us in terms of the kind of hiccup in the middle. Please feel free to reach out to us with any questions that you might have. If you're looking to get, your own warm-ups or different things incorporated, come check it out at platform.com. That's pltforum.com. And remember, it's always in pursuit of better.